Story 1. I work in emergency medical services and recently had a coworker who also works part-time at a neighboring fire department tell us about a coworker they had who moved out of his house and was living at the fire department. They did 24-hour shifts and each employee had a bedroom. This particular employee would just pick up as much overtime as possible, use the bedroom for sleep, the laundry room for his laundry, the kitchen to cook, and the showers. All of his personal items were kept in his truck. This lasted about 4 months before his coworkers caught on. His chief told him it wasn't a bad idea, but that it was time to move back into his own place. Story 2. I remember reading a story about a guy who had an internship at some big tech firm, I think Google, in an extremely high cost of living area. He bought an old U-Haul and outfitted it for living. He parked in the company lot as obscurely as possible and moved every so often. Used the company showers and such. Probably the best way to manage that situation if you could handle it. Story 3. I had a friend who would go to farmers markets and wait until the end of the day. Then, he would go up to people and offer to buy the leftovers at a discount. Not terribly exciting, but bold. Story 4. My best friend divorced his spendaholic wife who had gotten them into over $50,000 of credit card debt and wanted to take out a second mortgage on the house to buy herself another car. He ended up with half the debt, of course, but he moved in with his sister and dug himself out after 4 years. He lives alone now and is the most careful person with money I've ever seen. She's being supported by her parents who have her on a strict budget. She's almost 50 now. I shudder to think what will happen when they pass and she inherits. Story 5. Depends on what you mean by the boldest. I'd say the most audacious behavior I've seen was from my former roommate and ex-friend Sarah, a narcissist and professional mooch who used her friends to get a job, a cheap place to live, borrowed furniture, and even food, while also quietly stealing from us. I'm sure she effectively lowered her cost of living through theft and manipulation. Story 6. I got sick of continuously rising rents, moving rentals, and working full-time. So I bought a cheap houseboat and anchored it in the middle of the river in my city, close to everything and totally off-grid. There are no fees to anchor in the river, so besides the cheap cost of the houseboat and a kayak to get to and from, it was free. It was a bit inconvenient, but I did it for 5 years while working 3 to 4 days a week and saved up almost everything I earned. Just bought a house 50% cash a few years ago because of that houseboat stint. Story 7. My father-in-law is a contractor. Thus, he has to buy lots of supplies. He buys gift cards first, then buys thousands of dollars worth of supplies on the cards, also he can get the gas points. But because he has to buy so much for his business, it adds up significantly. He hasn't paid for gas in years. He also has to drive quite a bit, so it's a big money saver. Simultaneously, the biggest boomer move and the smartest cheating of the system I've ever seen. Story 8. A student was living in Los Angeles, in an apartment with a rent he could afford, but wanted to get a master's degree in engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. Because the Bay Area is one of the areas with the highest cost of living in the United States, the student decided to continue living in Los Angeles instead, and flew round-trip from Los Angeles International Airport to San Francisco International Airport at least 3 times a week. For the entire academic year, he spent approximately $5,600 on his transportation, roughly equating to $650 a month. Quite an interesting story. Story 9. A friend of mine works as an on-call pharmacist. He goes to rural pharmacies and takes over for a few weeks to a few months when their pharmacist is out. He makes around $60 per hour. His wife works for a large oil company and, based on her job, seems to earn a very high wage too. He bought a $1,200 van and put a mattress in it. That's where he lives while he's working so he can pocket the per diem. Story 10. I got sick of paying rent, so I bought a recreational vehicle and remodeled it to be a perfect bachelor pad. 40-inch television, surround sound, recliner chair, room for a stand-up jet ski. I paid someone in East Nashville $200 a month to park in their backyard and use their Wi-Fi. I saved up the rent I would have been paying and put a down payment on a duplex in 2016. It was a good call. Then, I lived in half of the duplex and sold the recreational vehicle for the same amount that I had into it, around $3,000. Story 11. Wife and I got rid of all our grass and turned our front and backyard into a food garden. We only needed to buy vegetables in the winter, but this year we've expanded more planting space so we may be able to freeze more. Food is very expensive now. Story 12. Lived in a van while working as an electrician for C-SPAN on all the Navy boats. Saw my friends spending $1,600 to $2,000 a month in rent. Meanwhile, my rent was $80 for insurance and about $300 in gas a month. My wife and I saved a lot for about 2 years doing that. I love the lifestyle. So easy to maintain. We built a 1993 Vandura high top during COVID. Still have the van for camping. It's awesome. Story 13. I don't think he did it to lower his cost of living. But a guy I worked with was sleeping in the woods behind the place we worked at. No tent, just a sleeping bag and a tarp. He would sneak into the building really early and use the showers in the mornings he worked. I don't know why he didn't sleep in his car in the parking lot. We later found out the guy had untreated mental illness. He was paranoid about the banks, would cash his entire check, and hide any unspent money in his underwear, socks, and shoes. He believed he was going to be locked into his apartment and imprisoned forever. Story 14. I was reading today about a German man who pays €5,888 for a Deutsche Bahn yearly travel card rather than rent an apartment. This gives him unlimited travel on the German train network, and he just sleeps on an overnight train every night. Story 15. Finding it really depressing that so many people are experiencing living in an actual building is too expensive, so I moved into my car. Like, how did we end up here? Story 16. My older sister had my niece at 18. She used me as daycare for the entirety of her college education. I babysat 8 to 10 hours a day for my sister because she promised when she got her first job she'd split her first paycheck with me. I was in high school at the time and didn't have a third or fourth period, so I'd watch my niece from around noon until my sister got home. Unfortunately, when I brought up our agreement, she went crazy on me and called me everything from entitled to selfish. But hey, she got a good 3 years of free childcare from me, and now she's living with an abusive alcoholic, so I can't let her babysit my kids. Story 17. My grandpa was abandoned in a tent with his 2 siblings in Montana during the Great Depression by his German immigrant parents. So I guess I didn't see it, but I saw the repercussions. Grandpa was a bit of an asshole. Story 18. Honestly, probably selling their gorgeous 5-bedroom house to downsize when they absolutely didn't need to. They were doing fine financially, but they basically eliminated having a mortgage by purchasing a smaller home outright with the equity they gained from their first home. It was a pretty impressive move, in my opinion, considering most people are always looking to upgrade. Now they have no debt and are the only people I know with fairly standard jobs who aren't currently struggling. Story 19. A friend of mine is a lifelong student. Whenever he has to cut hours to go back to school for another degree, he moves into his truck. He has been doing this for maybe 25 years now. He has it all fitted out and drives around the country doing rock climbing and studying while living in his truck. He has a gym membership for showers and a mobile hotspot for internet access. He is totally happy with it. The guy has so much charisma. Watching him flirt with a girl and offer a tour, then come back 40 minutes later with a big dumb grin, is fascinating. When he was more local to me, we would have him stay occasionally if he got sick or something because I didn't want him sick in his truck all by himself. Story 20. This was something I actually did. For a while, I rented an apartment that was being managed by a very incompetent real estate agency. Not only were they incompetent, but also shady as hell. By pure chance, I met someone who previously lived in my apartment and was cheated out of their 3-month deposit. They tried to sue the apartment owner but never managed as he lived abroad and was shielded by the shady real estate company. I was nervous to be screwed like they were once I had to leave the apartment. Luckily for me, the owner decided to sell it and, being the epitome of incompetence, the agency couldn't find my rental contract anywhere to pass on to the new owner. They asked me directly how much rent I was paying and if I could change my rental payments from the old owner's bank account to the new one. Being presented with a golden opportunity, I took the risk and claimed my rent was €200 lower than it used to be and promptly paid it to the new owner. No one said anything and I kept paying on time at a discount for some 5 or 6 months. After that period, they started complaining that my rent was too low and ended up requesting an increase of an insane €500, €300 more than I was originally paying. I got a lawyer to write them a letter explaining all the ways that increase was illegal and kept paying at my discounted price. They didn't try to fight back but were not happy. Since my contract was at risk of not being renewed, I graciously allowed them a €100 increase, which I guess was enough of a victory for the agency. It stayed like this for a couple more years, and I'm still amazed it worked. Story 21. My great-grandparents let my grandmother get married at 17, partially motivated by getting her out of the house because they had 10 children. She and my grandfather moved about 20 miles away. Her sisters and brothers would come and visit for extended periods of time, lessening the burden on the great-grandparents. Story 22. I can't say I've seen anyone do anything voluntarily. Living out of a car, being a semi-permanent resident at a campsite, these aren't things you do when everything is going well for you. I like the van life idea, but you have to live in the right part of the country because you don't have cheap control of temperature. Many of the cheap routes require a comfortable environment first, or it really starts to deteriorate quickly. You can certainly make do, but you're making real-life choices at that point. It also helps if the job allows it. Are you in a region where your travel and work sites are conducive to such living? Or are you just sitting in Walmart parking lots all your life? There are very fitting situations. Story 23. Boldest is generally moving somewhere completely different, but cheaper. You never know if it will work out, and it is harder to move back in some ways if it does not. I have done this, my sister did it, half our friends from our home state of California have done it. It worked out for most of us, but not all. Story 24. A college professor and his wife lived in a tent while he built a house. Because he taught full-time and was working on his Doctor of Philosophy degree, it took many years to build the house in the tropics, full of venomous insects and snakes. But that's the only way they could afford the house they wanted, to not pay rent for a few years and to build it with his own hands. Story 25. My wife and I got rid of almost all of our stuff, packed the rest into a storage unit, and moved out of our 5,000 square foot house and into a 30-foot travel trailer so she could be a traveling physical therapist assistant. We went from something like $10,000 per month to $5,000 per month. We spend a lot less because there is no space to put stuff, so we don't buy stuff. Story 26. When I was a graduate student in a master's program, I was very close to finishing and didn't want to sign a year-long lease. I slept on a wooden lab table with a sleeping bag and showered at the campus gym. Story 27. My brother rented out every room in his own house and then lived in the laundry room for a year. He had plenty of money and had basically no reason to do this, but he loves money, so I don't know. Story 28. A large family, when they washed clothes in the washing machine, would drain the rinse water into a utility sink. For the next load, they used a submersible pump to pump it back into the washer for the next wash cycle. In other words, they used the rinse water twice. First to rinse, then to wash the next load. They probably saved 30 to 50 gallons per load. Story 29. I used to work in the consumer packaged goods industry, specifically in grocery stores. We did digital imaging and data scraping for e-commerce. It was cheaper for companies to send case packs than individual items, which usually meant we'd receive cases of everything you see in a grocery store. I didn't buy toilet paper for 8 years and still have trash bags I got for free, even though I haven't worked there in over 3 years. I'm talking scallops, turkeys, soap, deodorant. My greatest haul was a $500 bottle of scotch. The job paid decently, but the free items were incredible. Story 30. I used to work in many abandoned buildings and houses. My friend asked me to get him an electric meter from a house. He would wait until after his meter readings were recorded and then swap out the meter with the one I got for him. He would swap it back after a couple of weeks, and this way he got 2 to 3 weeks of free electricity every month. He was a wild Korean War veteran, and this method got him extra money for alcohol every month. Story 31. When I was going to college in New York City, I remember it was discovered that a sophomore New York University student was living in the basement of Bob's library because he couldn't afford housing. Bob's boy was discovered, and the school made him a resident assistant. I think he became a software engineer and made an application to connect people to affordable housing. Story 32. A bit outdated now that newspapers are not really a thing anymore, but I knew a guy in Los Angeles who would read the papers for delinquent property tax notices. He would find a property that was empty and in a nice place in the Hollywood Hills. He would keep an eye on it for a week or so to make sure it was really empty. Then he would just move in. He would clean the place up, hire gardeners to keep the bushes trimmed and the grass cut, and since he was not paying rent, he could afford to have repairs done. He even had the carpet replaced in one place. Eventually, the owner or property manager or a real estate person would show up, usually months or even years later, and call the police on him. But he would have a fake lease in hand, plus a stack of handwritten receipts for the cash rent he had been paying monthly to the guy who rented it to me. He would be very apologetic and understanding, and because he had proof that he was a tenant, it took at least 90 days to evict him. During that 90 days, he would watch the papers for delinquent tax notices. He kept it up for about 10 years, until the real estate market got so hot that there simply were not any empty places anymore. But he probably saved about $250,000 in rental expenses during that time, and really, he left those houses better than he found them.